Hello and welcome everyone to Global Minds, the Harvard Alumni for Global Development podcast. This is your host Vivek. Here in Global Minds, we invite global development professionals from different walks of life and talk about their experience of trying to make the world a better place. And today we have a Harvard College alumna who is doing some really incredible work through her venture, Change Water Labs, and other avenues, Diana Yousef. Thank you so much for joining, Diana. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So before I jump to my questions, I'd like to offer a short introduction of Diana for our audience. So Diana Yousef is the founder and CEO of Change Water Labs, which is a mission-driven clean tech venture developing disruptive technologies to increase safe, sustainable, and scalable access to clean water and sanitation. Diana is a serial entrepreneur with over 10 years experience commercializing technology for social and environmental impact in the developing world. Formerly, she consulted for McKinsey, co-founded IFC/World Bank's Life Sciences Investment Group and the United Nations Inclusive Markets Incubator. She has co-founded several other social ventures focused on sustainable technologies. She's a former protein biochemist with a bachelor's from Harvard and a PhD from Cornell in the field. And she also holds an MBA and MA in international development from Columbia. Quite rich and illustrious and interdisciplinary career and education, I must say. Anything I missed in that introduction that you'd like to add?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. Well, maybe I alluded to your work with Change Water Labs. So maybe let's start with that. Could you explain a bit about the kind of work that you're doing and maybe also more on your role in this, I don't know, to call it company or a venture or an
Yeah,
enterprise. So I would love to hear more.
sure. So I founded Change Water Labs. I started working on the concept in 2013, but we got founded as a for-profit company in 2015 and have been working since then, essentially to take an idea that I had and turn it into a reality. The idea was actually the idea sort of had its first light bulb go on in 2009. I was working with NASA on ways to recycle water on the space station. And one of the approaches that was considered but not actually implemented during that work was the use of breathable materials. So materials that have the property of taking moisture from one side of the material and pulling it through and releasing it on the other side of the material as vapor. And we all know materials like that, like our sportswear that keeps us dry when we're working out. There are other types of materials like that. But anyway, it was proposed as a way to separate pure water out of wastewater and then be able to reuse the water in space. And I thought, well, you don't have to go to space to find places where there's insufficient ways to treat water that are low cost and low carbon. And the reason for low carbon is because a lot of the places that don't have sufficient water treatment are also places that don't have sufficient power. And so I do have a background and also just a personal connection to the developing world. My parents are from the Middle East. And it sort of had this idea that essentially, why don't we try to see if this is an approach for how can we deal with wastewater treatment and water treatment in poor communities, vulnerable communities, and fragile communities here on Earth. So with that, I started Change Water Labs a couple years later to develop the concept of a waste evaporating toilet for places with no plumbing. So the need being that half the world's population lives in places where they don't have safe, clean toilets, and that's because they live in places where they either don't have a hookup to water or they don't have a hookup to sewage plumbing, and
Mhm.
so they can't flush. And so the idea that I had, and this is sort of going back into my being a scientist, I was thinking, well, if 95% of human waste is water, and we could evaporate that waste without using a lot of energy, then maybe we could shrink the problem and essentially flush the toilet without pipes.
Wow, that's a great, evolution of this idea from space station to well, is it already implemented in different regions? Yeah.
Yeah, we've been piloting it in well, we piloted in two regions. So one, our first pilot was in Uganda in 2020, where we piloted the first version of the iThrone, um, and uh, and then we made a number of design enhancements to make it sort of yeah, a more sophisticated product. And we piloted the newer version of the iThrone in Panama, in an indigenous community in Panama City, with the idea that what we were really saw as the key need as we go forward
Hmm.
is, would be the problem of lack of sanitation in urban areas, because, those are tight spaces and they're growing fast, but infrastructure isn't expanding as quickly as urban populations and urban construction. So we were looking for a solution that could kind of keep things, compact and deal with the waste, on a day-to-day basis by eliminating it, getting rid of it, but without needing a hookup to infrastructure. And so we're targeting the urban need for, I mean, there are a number of other needs, but basically the urban need for waterless, sewerless toilet.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, being based in Nepal and from Nepal, I definitely understand the importance of, having such a system where obviously, as you mentioned, half of the world's population isn't connected to proper sewage and water treatment systems. So, yeah, I can imagine it can be revolutionary in those areas. Yeah. Has your interest always been in, using technology for greater good for the global impact, or has it evolved later in your career? Like, did you always have that outward facing, even as a scientist?
Yeah, no, that's so I've always had this deep passion to help address sort of the human development goals and now the sustainability development goals, um, especially in poorer parts of the world. Again, I said my parents are immigrants to the U.S. from the Middle East, and I know what poverty looks like from that point of view, and how much opportunity is lost when people can't have access to basic things that they need to live. And so it's always been something that I've, wanted to have an impact on. But I also really loved, sort of the wonder of science and discovery, and how does nature work at the very most molecular level. And so I was training to be a scientist, but while I was in the lab, I had, I would be listening to the, BBC News and other, international news to understand how, what life was like in developing parts of the world. And had this vague idea, but I didn't really know how it would come together, that maybe I could bring a new toolkit to the efforts of development, by being a translator of science into impact. Um, I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know what that job was called. But I did spend a lot of my career trying to figure out how can I link the dots. And I tried it within larger organizations, a few different ways, but eventually decided that maybe it was time for me to actually start a venture that translated a scientific innovation into something that could have transformational impact on people
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
the environment too.
Definitely. Yeah. No, it seems like you've kind of supported quite a few of those sustainable technology type ventures. But as you mentioned, you also worked with some bigger organizations in this world, such as the World Bank and the UN. Um, so, in your experience working with them directly or indirectly, I imagine even right now you have to partner with some of these development organizations in your work. Um, have you found that you know technology is integrated enough in the work, or there's still scope for, bridging this science with the development work? Where have you been seeing this integration?
Huh. I definitely see it much more within, the entrepreneurial realm. I mean, I think, smaller
Mm,
organizations can be much more nimble and much more focused. So they definitely, at some point, need to work with bigger actors to scale their impact. And, but I think culturally, those bigger organizations just have a harder time with innovation. Um, and so, I think it's a process, sorry, to to try to build those partnerships. I mean, we actually right now our way that we're planning on getting our product to the market is initially through partnerships with other businesses, and then we would, hope to then eventually, start to work with the larger, multilaterals and NGOs because at the moment, they have, I think those large organizations, they have so many demands put on them, and they tend to be very risk averse. So they don't tend to be adopters of, like, the first adopters of new technology. I think it depends on what the area is. I mean, I think maybe, you know, cell phone tech and digital tech might be easier for those organizations to integrate because there's less risk. But with a technology that has such an impact on public health and the quality of water in a poor region, I think, they probably need more reassurance on how it's going to be, a safe option. And so I think we've had interest from a number of these NGOs, and our first pilot was funded by one of the development organizations. But I think, yeah, it's I was very encouraged back when, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton started a science and technology arm of USAID to help promote new ventures and around the world that are developing technologies to address the SDGs. And I think that that's another part of the puzzle. And so, yeah, I'm encouraged to see some of those efforts.
right. Definitely. I mean, I work in the education development sector, and cutting edge technologies like the artificial intelligence is increasingly being talked about and brought in the agenda in this work. So, but I mean, what you said about trying to minimize the risk of these new inventions and innovations, but also the culture within these organizations of how they innovate and integrate new innovations. I think definitely points to why maybe they are not going parallelly with the scientific world in their work. Right, but do you see this changing, or how do you see some like opportunities in the horizon of this work that new technologies will be taken up more, or do you still see there's some challenging space in this work?
Yeah, I mean, there's always challenges when you're trying to, create and validate a new technology and then get it adopted into the market. Uh, and then there's the added layer of when you're trying to do something like what we're doing, which is, really technology development and years of pre-revenue, um, you know, R&D, um, before you can see a profit or before you can see an even revenue. I think, and trying to get the resources for that, I mean, investors, a lot of investors don't jump at the idea of funding a technology that has technology risk, but then also when you're launching it to the market, maybe your first markets are primarily emerging markets, and those are markets that are less familiar to a lot of the investor class. So, um, I think that yeah, there challenge is to get the resources and to also just have the comfort level of bringing together the technology risk paired up with what can be perceived as the market risk, because we're not doing sort of the standard OECD markets. Um, but I think that, you know, slowly, we're seeing that some of those sustainability issues are not just isolated for, vulnerable communities and poorer countries, but that, the wealthier countries are starting to understand that water isn't infinite. And, we're going to have to come up with a better way to recycle and conserve water. So one of the things that we were very conscious of when we started Change Water was, um, while the soul of the team is, around the mission, we need to make sure that the business doesn't subsidize mission from profit. So, um,
Mm.
to the extent that we can align our impact mission with increased profitability, the more likely we can grow both without having to sort of choose between one or the other. And I think that's hard for some sectors. I used to be in sort of the more, biotech sector. And, the biotech that I was interested in was how can we come up with new drugs and therapeutics and diagnostics for, neglected diseases, or, diseases that we don't see in the Western world. And it was hard for me to figure out how can you not have to trade off profit with impact. Um,
Mm.
because those are so costly to develop and to distribute. And so, but sustainability technologies, I think, because the whole world is dealing with climate change and the whole world is dealing with increasing scarcity of resources, that we need to figure out solutions for both developed and developing countries. And every time we can sell a toilet, we we expand our impact, but we also extend our profitability. So that was a very intentional choice that we made to try to be able to preserve our mission while growing a business that had could grow on a for-profit model.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and I was definitely wanting to ask you about this for-profit social
Hmm.
venture model that, you're balancing both
Yeah.
profitability as well as impact in your mission. And I think often where certain organizations fail is because they just choose one at the risk of the other. And like certain NGOs who are trying to make a big social impact can't sustain because they're dependent on grant funding because they can generate, they don't have a sustainable business model. But on the other hand, where, as you mentioned, gave the example of biotech, certain industries are just focused on making profits,
Yeah.
which, may compromise the greater mission that they have.
Especially in
So,
technology too, because I think, if you're developing a new technology, there are years of investing in the technology before you see any kind of revenue. So I think to some extent, if we are going to be developing new technologies to try to solve some of these problems, they're, looking at that model of how do you sustain that pre-revenue development, for
mm,
how many ever years, and then how do you ensure that that gets paid back?
right.
Yeah,
Right, because it's a big risk that you're taking, right,
yeah,
by investing in that R&D and
yeah,
all of that development.
yeah,
Definitely. Right, but I think another thing you mentioned is how the world is increasingly so interconnected. That impact in one place isn't just isolated.
right,
We're seeing that with climate change.
right,
Just a couple of days back, we had enormous amount of rainfall and flooding and a lot of
yeah.
damage because of that here in Kathmandu. And
In the
so
US too. Yeah,
yeah,
North
so
Carolina. Yeah,
so I mean, so we can see, like effects and they aren't localized anymore. We can feel the effects of climate change and other global environmental problems everywhere. And I think, as you mentioned, this may be sort of one of the main reasons that countries, developed countries, should invest in these technologies because, as you said, the impact is shared everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, have you received, like, I mean, you mentioned that one of your pilots was supported by a donor agency, I assume. So is this an easy conversation to have? Is it easy to sell, make a case for this for investment, or do you have to show like a sustainable business model and returns for investment in this
Yeah.
work?
I mean, I think we have kind of a hybrid, right? Uh, the way that we think about it is that probably the most eager adopters of our technology initially are going to be the markets that have the greatest need, which means the markets that, where there's no other alternative to our product. But eventually, there are applications of our technology that do fit needs in the more developed markets where there are alternatives, but there are probably some applications that those alternatives don't address. And so, and as our product gets sort of more sophisticated and we get more sophisticated about knowing how to make the product and manage it when it's that the aftermarket part of it, then I think we probably have more of a capability of essentially um, supporting more sort of like what I'd say like more premium market segments where maybe the goal is more about green construction or off-grid housing or increased public sanitation in downtown areas or transportation bathroom cabins. And so there are these other like sort of more upscale or it's not upscale, but more premium tiered like products that we can essentially adapt because we have a platform technology that can adapt to not only multiple applications within sanitation, but also multiple applications within water treatment. And so I think we see this as a progression, sort of like getting early market adoption with the most eager customers where there's the most need, but then building up. And as we're getting better at doing this, the markets that we can also address are getting to have more sophisticated needs.
Right.
So yeah.
No, that makes sense. And yeah, I think it's great to have a technology that can be used in multiple settings in different ways. Yeah, I think, and that will leave a lot of space to evolve and go to different markets and target groups. Um, yeah, I mean, so you've been, working in, you started the Change Water Labs, but you've also, as I mentioned, helped start some other different social ventures, and even with the UN and the World Bank, IFC, I think you were working in sort of helping others, grow and sort
Mhm.
of in incubator space, in entrepreneurship space. So I was, curious to ask, what does it take to build a good social venture, to start something that can create a big impact? Is it
Yeah.
about the idea, the technology? Is it about connections? Is it about the population you serve? Yeah, some lessons that you learned
I,
in this journey.
there are a couple of elements, right? When I first had the idea of essentially, using evaporation as a way to address sanitation, um, it was like a very, like, I think it just didn't connect with a lot of people. And so even though I thought it was a good idea, there were sort of two things that needed to happen in order for me to um, be able to move forward with it. One was, I think you really do have to talk to the stakeholders in that market and find out really what their needs are. And try to see if what you're planning, and again, it's when it's in concept phase, it's not very defined. It's just sort of like, if we could come up with a solution that theoretically could do X, would that have a benefit? Would that have a use? And and for sanitation, you have to talk to a whole host of stakeholders. I mean, it's not just the end users of the toilets, it's also the, who's operating the toilets, who's paying for the toilets, who's installing the toilets, who are all the, the municipalities. So who are all the entities that, need to derive a value from a new solution? And we have to do that regularly throughout the course of developing the product, because as we learn more about what our technology can do, and okay, it's got these limitations, it's got these capabilities, we have to keep, sort of tweaking and course correcting in order to make sure that we're staying close to what would have a value to, both the buyers, but also the whole larger ecosystem of stakeholders. So there's that, like just making sure that you don't fall in love with an idea and sort of try to impose it on a market, but making sure it has some relevance to the market. But then the other thing is, and this was kind of a big revelation for me, is you have to know how to tell the story in a way that compels other people, because you can't do this type of thing alone. And it doesn't matter how amazing the technology is, if you can't tell the story, you might as well go home. And I learned that very early on. When I think I was at a forum, and I was given a minute to pitch my technology, and I did such an utterly horrible job of it. And thank God they weren't planning on broadcasting it, but I just felt like, my God, what is wrong with me? Why can't I tell the story? And I was at a conference, and I mean, this sounds a bit ridiculous, but I went and I spent like half the like the next 2 hours of the conference like under a stairwell trying to come up with what's the story, like what's the catchy, way that in a couple of words I can describe what we do. And that's when I came up with, and this is something I haven't mentioned on this particular discussion, but that's when I came up with the name for the technology, which is shrink wrap for crap, which essentially, because of the idea that what we're doing is we're actually have this membrane that shrinks the waste by sucking up the water and then, making it disappear, because it's converting it from liquid to gas. So it makes it disappear, but it makes everything shrink. And so once I started being able to like use that and get a visual in people's head where on the one hand, it's, it's kind of entertaining, but on the other hand, it's you can kind of get the concept like in a couple of words, and you can kind of visually see it, and you can understand, you can make a quick linkage as to why that would be a solution to a really hard problem. um, then I was able to start attracting resources. I started getting, I started being able to attract some funding. I was able to start attracting some collaborators, some teammates, and I wasn't able to do that before. So if you can't tell the story, then it's really hard to make any progress on moving a venture or a mission forward.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's probably marketing 101. It's
Yeah,
like it's not the product that you're selling, it's the story that you're selling.
yeah,
And right, no, I mean, this is something I've heard from other development practitioners that I've interviewed in this podcast as well. They've mentioned that, it's not just enough to do good work and hope that people will acknowledge and notice you, but it's important to be intentional about sharing your story and finding that language, as you said, that resonates with people, that people can easily understand. And I imagine, I mean, this is not just relevant in conferences or, I mean, attracting investors, but also when, as you mentioned, you have to go to the communities and talk with the users, right? And build partnerships. So I'm sure that is also important to communicate this idea easily in an accessible way. But no, I think the other part about developing partnerships with the users and the communities, the government, everyone who is all the stakeholders that are engaged in this product. Um, has that been like what you've practiced throughout this journey, or I think, there's an approach to doing the development work, right?
Mhm.
Increasingly, the development industry is also talking about localization and
Yeah.
how it's important that, it's not just an idea that is brought to a place, but then the idea kind of evolves and has ownership in the local community so that it's sustainable, so that,
Mhm.
right, it's used properly.
Yeah.
um, has your understanding of how to do this work, how to connect with the communities, also evolved as you've been doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were very aware at the very beginning that, um, sitting here in Boston, we're going to need a lot of partnership with the local actors, who are going to eventually be the ones to, install, implement, and service the tool that we're creating. So we think of ourselves as a solutions provider, but we were very conscious from the very beginning that we need our solution to be something that's easily integrable with whatever the sort of on the ground operators are doing or need to do. So we just tried to keep it as simple as possible, as far as uh, and have our tool essentially integrate into as many of the sort of like servicing, pathways as was possible. So, instead of making it very, finicky, so that there's really only one way to, use our solution in a particular context, we wanted to make it so that, once it's there, and then, either there's established sanitation servicing, um, or that sanitation servicing is new to a particular area because they weren't managing it before, and then they need to sort of organically grow some kind of way to service it, some kind of value chain around it. We wanted to make it so that, it could either integrate into what was already existing, or easily help, easily uh, help to, or I guess easily enable a community, or the servicers within a community to develop something around it that wasn't too onerous. So I think we were aware of that from the beginning, but what we're learning, we essentially learn the details of that every time we engage with the new community, and we try to remember to stay humble so that um, we can take their lead on what they need and what they're able to do, and then try to help them to succeed with our solution.
Right. No, I think that's really important. Have that learning attitude, but also, give the leadership back to the community. And also, what you mentioned about integrating this technology within the system that already exists. Um, right. I'm also interested, I think, in learning about, your personal motivations and what inspires you, what is the best rewarding part about this work for you. I
Yeah.
mean, we touched upon, how from your sort of background with immigrant parents to this work that you did, in different organizations has shaped how you're thinking about your work. But also, what do you find most rewarding about doing your work? Is it the science part as a scientist, or is it about thinking how the science applies to to creating a bigger impact, or other things?
Yeah. There are a lot of elements, I think. I think one that gives me the most energy is when we interact with the people on the ground.
Mm.
And just sort of, the reality of what we're, what we're if we're helping them to do something better, and um if we're helping to open up new possibilities for them. And I guess just the engagement. I mean, I'm an extrovert, so I like engaging with people and co-problem solving. So I find the engagement with those partners very energizing for me. It took us a while to get there, so it was a tough slog when we were still in the sort of concept and development phase, but we're starting to have that. And that's been, that reminds me, like, oh yeah, like I always wanted to be um, problem solving with people in a productive way. And, now we're going to start to be able to do that with people all over the world in a way that, helps everybody. So I think that's a source of energy for me. And then I like problem solving just generally. So I think, thinking through, connecting the dots on, okay, we have limited information and we have limited resources, and how can we make something new and disruptive happen? Trying to think through, like, how can we solve this problem? How can we get around this? How can we motivate, you know, people to partner with us or entities to partner with us? How do we, um, and then I also tend to like to think in terms of systems. So, like, we're developing a technology, but it has to fit into a reality. And so, what are the constraints and what are the opportunities? And thinking through, okay, if you have these constraints, it's like a puzzle, right? So you have to figure out, like, okay, how are we going to make this thing work when we know that we can do this or we can't do this, or there are these five things we need to pay attention to. Um, that that's kind of, it's like a jigsaw puzzle or like a crossword puzzle for me. So
Mm.
I enjoy that. Um, but yeah, I think it's initially it's the people aspect, but then it's also kind of like the puzzle aspect of it.
Mm. Right. No, I totally get it. It's engaging in the creative process, as you mentioned, the problem
Yeah,
solving. I think even the limitations are, part of it. That,
yeah,
given these limitations, how do you adapt your idea and product, and how do you make sure the system runs smoothly?
right.
And right, and I think when you see your technology being used, and how it is benefiting other people, I'm sure that's also a big source of energy and
Yeah.
inspiration for everyone. So no, that's great to hear. I always find people's personal motivations very interesting, so I add this question in my interviews.
I mean, I also
um,
had a, like, early on when pretty much there were a million ways that this could have failed. And really waking up every day to try to be motivated to do this when it just looks like, oh, this is too big a problem, where this is too far away. This is,
mm,
there are too many ways that this could fail. I had just other motivations too. And I mean, I think one of them was I'm the mother of three daughters. And my own personal journey was that, when I started Change Water, like right before that, what had happened was I think my career had kind of taken a nosedive because I became a mom and changed cities like at the same time. And so suddenly I was just kind of off the career track altogether. And so I decided, like, okay, well, I guess this is the time to try to create something myself, because I don't fit anywhere. And career wise or job wise, and having these daughters, I kind of was realizing, like, for this is like for women,
mm,
this we can't keep perpetuating generation after generation that a woman, who has all these, skills and all this experience and all these things to share, suddenly has no, use. There is not, has no, doesn't fit anywhere when she has a kid. So I guess the thing that motivated me to keep going was I have got to figure out a way to prove to my three daughters that that's not the
Mm.
pathway for them.
Right.
So that was another motivation that's just more
Mhm.
personal.
Yeah, no, I think thank you for sharing that. And I think, I mean, that's a very important thing that, often motherhood and this whole process, uh, you know, um, puts a pause in a lot of women's professional careers.
Yeah.
But then how this motivated you to start something on your own and continue and persevere despite, as you mentioned, the probability of failing. I think speaks a lot to your perseverance, but also the motivation that
Desperation.
the motivation that you've found in your girls. So no, I think that's really amazing, and seems like you are on the path to success. As you look forward, is there anything, where do you see this going? Is there anything you're most excited about? Anything
Yeah.
you want to share with everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think like so I mean we are fundraising right now, so we'll, fingers crossed that we can get through
Mm.
that and keep going, because we're kind of at that tipping point of taking these things from sort of the pilot phase to, global market launch phase. What I'm, so assuming that we can get the resources we need, I'm excited to essentially just engage with more communities and get and more operators and get this technology out there at a larger scale, um, and sort of enter that new phase where we're less about kind of you know product development and discovery and more about um, deployment and having impact.
Right. Yeah. Well, best wishes on this next phase, and hope to see this product spread across the world, including where I am. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story and joining us today. And yeah, hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.